In this video, you're going to learn how to set up and use Git, which is a version control system. Git is going to let you keep track of the changes to your project over time. This is really useful when something goes wrong and you need to revert to a previous state in the project where things were working. It's also super useful for backing up your work. Now, in the real world, every single company uses some form of version control. It is essential to the software development process, and most of them are using Git. Git has become really popular, dominating the market share for version control. Git is also free and open source, and there is a ton of great educational material. They have a book on how to learn Git, it's free, and Stack Overflow is filled with Git-specific questions and answers. In this course, we're going to be using Git to save our project. We're also going to be using it to back up our work to a service called GitHub. And finally, we'll be using Git to deploy our project live to the web. So we'll be able to take our web server and deploy it for anybody to visit. It won't just be available on localhost. To get started, you are going to need to install Git on your computer, but luckily for you, it is a really simple installation process. There's nothing crazy you need to do. It's one of those installers where you just click next through a few steps. So let's go ahead and do that. We can grab the installer by heading over to the browser and going to git-scm.com. Here we can find a lot of resources about how to use Git as well as download the installer. Before we go ahead and install it, I want to show you this link down here to the book called Pro Git. It is a free book and you can read it online. It covers everything that Git has to offer. We'll be looking at some of the more basic features in this course, but I could easily create an entire course on Git. There actually is Udemy courses just on Git and GitHub. So if you want to learn more than what we cover here, I'd recommend reading this book or checking out a course, whatever your preferred learning method is. On the right-hand side of the homepage, you're going to have a little computer screen that should have a download button for your operating system, whether it's Windows, Linux, or Mac. You can go ahead and click that, which should take you to the installer page. Now, lately there's been a problem with SourceForge where you have to actually click here to download manually in order to start the download. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And after 5 seconds, we should be able to get the installer downloading. Once it's done, we can simply run it. Here we go. The installer is downloading. I'm going to go back to Git and get off of SourceForge since it's got a ton of ads. Super annoying. Down below, we have the installer. I'm going to go ahead and click it. You should be seeing a screen similar to mine, whether you're on Linux, OS X, or Windows. Now, the installer might start for you. If you're on OS X, you're going to need to launch the package installer. And you might get this message saying that it's from an unidentified developer. This is because it is distributed via a third party as opposed to being in the OS X App Store. We can go ahead and right-click, click Open, and confirm that we do indeed want to open it. Once you're at the installer, the process is going to be pretty simple. You can essentially click Continue and Next throughout every step. If you're on Windows, though, there is an important distinction. Inside of the installer, you're going to see a screen just like this. It is really important that you also install Git Bash, as shown here. Git Bash is a program that simulates a Linux-type terminal, and it's going to be really essential when we create our SSH keys in the next video to uniquely identify our machine. For now, though, we can go ahead and move through the installer. If you're on Windows, make sure you install Git Bash as well. Continue, install. I'm going to confirm by typing my password. Then the installer should get moving. Once it's done, we can go ahead and actually test that things installed successfully. I'm going to close it down. I'm also going to close down the directory, and I'll move into the terminal. From the terminal, we can go ahead and run git --version. This is going to print the version of Git you have installed. And right here, you can see I have Git version 2.9.2. Now, if you have your terminal still open and you're getting an error like git command not found, I'd recommend trying to restart your terminal. Sometimes that is required when you're installing new commands, like the git command which we just installed. From here, though, we are ready to turn our node web server directory into a Git repository. In order to do this, we're going to run a command called git init. Git init needs to get executed from the root of your project, the folder that has everything that you want to keep track of. In our case, the node web server is that folder. It has our server.js file, our package.json file, and all of our directories. Right here, from the server folder, I'm going to run git init. And all this does is it creates a .git directory inside of that folder. And I can prove that by running ls-a. go ahead and run these commands from git bash if you're on Windows. Right here, I get all of the directories, including the hidden ones, and right here I do indeed have .git. Now this directory is not something you should be manually updating. We're going to be using commands from the terminal in order to make changes to the Git folder. You don't want to be going in there manually messing around with things because there's a pretty good chance you're going to corrupt the Git repository and all of your hard work is going to become useless. Now obviously if it's backed up, it's not a big deal, but there really is no reason to go into that Git folder. I'm going to use clear to clear the terminal output. And now we can start looking at exactly how Git works. As I mentioned, Git is responsible for keeping track of the changes to your project, but by default, it doesn't actually track any of your files. We have to tell Git exactly which files we want it to keep track of. And there's a good reason for this. There are files in every project that you're most likely not going to want to add to your Git repo, and we'll talk about which ones and why in just a second. For now, let's go ahead and run a command, git status. Now all these commands need to get executed from inside of the root of the project. If you try to run this outside of a repository, you're going to get an error like git repository not found. What that means is that Git cannot find that .git directory in order to actually get the status of your repository. When we run this command, we're going to get some output that looks like this. And the important pieces for now is the untracked files header and all of the files underneath it. These are all of the files and folders that Git sees, but it's currently not tracking. Git doesn't know if you want to keep track of the changes to these files or if you want to ignore them from your repository. Now the views folder, for example, this is something we definitely want to keep track of. This is going to be essential to the project, and we want to make sure that whenever someone downloads the repository, they get the views folder. The log file, on the other hand, doesn't really need to be included in Git. In general, our log files are not going to be committed since they usually contain information specific to a point in time when the server was running. Right here we have server.js, our public folder, and package.json. These are all essential to the process of executing the app. These are definitely going to be added to our Git repository, and up above we have the node modules folder. The node modules folder is what's called a generated folder. Generated folders are easily generated by running a command. In our case, we can regenerate this entire directory using npm install. We're not going to want to add node modules to our Git repository because its contents differ depending on the version of npm you have installed and depending on the operating system you're using. It's best to leave off node modules and let every person who uses your repository manually install the modules on the machine they're actually going to be running the app. Now we have these 6 folders and files listed right here, so let's go ahead and add the 4 we want to keep. To get started, we're going to use the git add command. Git add lets you tell Git you want to keep track of a certain file. I'm going to type git add space package dot JSON. After I do this, I can run git status again, and this time we get something very different. Now we have an initial commit header. This is new, and we have our old untracked files header. Notice under untracked files, we don't have package.json anymore. That is moved up to the initial commit header. These are all of the files that are going to be saved, also known as committed, when we make our first commit, which we'll do in just a little bit. Now we can move on adding the 3 others. I'm going to use git add again to tell Git we want to track that public directory. I can run git status to confirm it was added as expected. Right here, you can see the public help file is now going to be committed to Git once we run a commit. Next up, we can add server.js with git add server.js, and we can add the views directory using git add views, just like this. I'm going to run a git status to confirm everything looks good, and it does indeed look good. Now these untracked files, they're going to sit around here until we do one of 2 things. We either add them to the Git repository or we ignore them using a custom file that we're going to create over inside of Atom. Inside of Atom, what I'd like you to do in the root of your project is make a new file called .gitignore. The gitignore file is going to be part of our Git repository, and it tells Git which folders and files you want to ignore. In this case, we can go ahead and ignore node underscore modules, just like this. When we save the gitignore file and rerun git status from the terminal, we're now going to get a really different result. Down below, you can see we have a new untracked file, gitignore, but the node modules directory is nowhere in sight, and that's exactly what we want. We want to remove this completely, making sure that it never, ever, ever gets added to the Git repo. Next up, we can go ahead and ignore that server.log file by typing its name, server.log right here. I'm going to go ahead and save gitignore, run git status from the terminal one more time, and make sure everything looks great. Right here, we have gitignore as our only untracked file. The server log file and node modules are nowhere in sight. Now that we have gitignore, we are going to be adding it to Git using git add .gitignore. Excellent. Now when I run git status, we should be able to see that all of the files that show up are under the initial commit. So now it's time to make a commit. Now, a commit really only requires two things. It requires some change in the repository. In this case, we're teaching Git how to track a ton of new files, so we are indeed changing something, and it requires a message. Now, we've already handled the file part of things. We've told Git what we want to save, we just haven't actually saved it yet. In order to make our first commit and save our first thing into the Git repository, we're going to run git commit. And we are going to be providing one flag, the M flag, which is short for message. After there, inside of quotes, we can go ahead and specify the message that we want to use for this commit. It's really important to use these messages so when someone's digging through the commit history, the list of all the changes to the project, they're actually useful. In this case, initial commit is always a good message for your first commit. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and right here, you see all of the changes that happened to the repo. We have created a bunch of new files inside of the Git repository. These are all of the files that we told Git we want to keep track of, and this is fantastic. We now have our very first commit, which essentially means that we've saved the project at its current state. If we make a big change to server.js, messing stuff up, and we can't figure out how to get it back to the way it was, we can always get it back because we made a Git commit. Now, we're going to explore some more fancy Git things in the future. We'll be talking about how to do most of the things you'd want to do with Git, including deploying to Heroku and pushing to GitHub. But for now, that is it. We're just looking at how to add files to Git and how to make that first commit. We'll talk more about Git soon. In the next video, we're going to be setting up both GitHub and Heroku. Then we'll worry about how to push our code and deploy it. I am super excited to get to it, so stay tuned. I will see you soon.